far away.
Okay, all right. All right, so here with Bill Ayers for the Spark News. I'm just gonna ask you a little bit questions about, especially with the Occupy movement. So, can I get your thoughts on the Occupy movement?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very excited about Occupy Wall Street and the spontaneous occupies that have jumped up all over the place, because it's really an expression of a lot of grievances that have been going on for a long time. But one of the problems with grievances and with oppression is it's sometimes hard to figure that there's any reason to resist. I mean, it just plows you over and people feel, powerless in the face of it. And what's great about Occupy is it gave people a space and a way to resist. And nobody would have predicted this 2 months ago. I don't think any of us here would have predicted it. But then again, nobody predicted that Rosa Parks sitting in on the bus that day would kick off the civil rights movement. So every revolution before it happens seems implausible or impossible, and afterwards it seems inevitable. So my feeling is that this is a great thing, that young people in motion, naming the world, naming their grievances, naming their hopes and aspirations is always a good thing.
Definitely. And since you were an activist back in the 1960s and even today, you could say, what is your advice to the activists in the streets and around the world?
Well, I mean, I think activists in the streets and around the world have to, keep their own counsel. And so I think one of the great things is that the activists at Wall Street have resisted being sucked in by the political class into talking to them on their terms, and they've kind of kept their own momentum. I mean, my advice, and this is going to be the theme of what I talk about tonight, is always the same. Keep your eyes open your eyes, see the world anew every day, try to make sense of it, and act on whatever the known demands, and then doubt whether you've got everything right, and rethink it and act again. So I think these folks in Tahrir Square, like the women in Mississippi, 50 years ago, have awakened a giant, a sleeping giant, and I think that that's what the Occupied Wall Street folks potentially are doing. They're awakening a sleeping giant. Nobody could have predicted a general strike in Oakland. In fact, the week before the general strike in Oakland, right after the police riot that had caused all that damage, my younger brother, was at the General Assembly when they were talking about doing a general strike. And he said to himself, this is overreaching, this will never work. And then he thought, I'm an old guy, I don't need to give that kind of advice, so he just shut up. Then a week later, they pulled it off. Who could have predicted that, right? So I think people have to open their eyes and act, and that's what I think is happening.
Definitely. And to kind of switch it from Occupy to just education, the way that you see public education is there any way that we can, as social justice educators, what are some of the things and steps that we need to do to get a more aware student body?
Well, the schools and education in general is always a contested space. It always has been, it always will be. So people need to get over the kind of despair of feeling that, gee, this is tough and we're on the defensive. I mean, one of the obstacles to redefining education in a way that would be humanistic and humane and more inclusive and more decent for everybody, one of the obstacles is the feeling on the part of social justice educators or progressive educators that we are barricaded, that we're a tiny minority, and I don't buy it. We're not barricaded and we're not a tiny minority. What we have to do is learn to speak a vocabulary that embraces people rather than driving people away. Linked to that is the feeling that we have these precious ideas that only we few can understand. That's also nonsense. We have to find a way to speak in a vocabulary and a language that can reach out and embrace the aspirations of most people. So I think what we have to do is redefine the discussion. We have to reframe the discussion. And by that I mean, framing is very powerful. So if a politician during the last election, you heard them say this, if a politician says, we need to get the lazy, incompetent teachers out of the classroom, that's framing the question. You and I aren't going to stand up and say, no, leave the lazy, incompetent teacher where she is. I don't want my grandchildren to have the lazy, incompetent teacher. So the guy who makes that statement wins the argument. If I reframed that and I got to the podium first and said, every kid in a public school deserves an intellectually curious, ethically grounded, compassionate, caring, well-rested, and well-paid teacher in the classroom, I'd win the argument. So the question is, who's framing this educational debate? The people who are framing it are using a big metaphor, and the metaphor is that education is a product, like a box of bolts or a refrigerator or a stove that's sold in the marketplace. That's not only an inadequate, but it's a deeply flawed and false metaphor, especially for a democratic society. So I want to reframe that. I want to argue that education is a human right. Education is encoded in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 26. Everyone has a right to an education. In a democracy, we need to believe and we need to act on the idea that the fullest development of every human being depends on the fullest development of all of us together. And acting on that is the kind of reframing we need to do so that the debate about improving the schools isn't about outsourcing and merit pay and all these other negative kinds of ideas, but is more about giving every kid access to a full and decent chance in the culture and in the society.
Definitely. Can you speak kind of on colonization in the curriculum, as in the way that there is a lack of teaching black and brown students their history, and pretty much of all people of color of their history?
Well, I mean, I think that the schools often act in poor neighborhoods and immigrant neighborhoods in traditionally oppressed African American neighborhoods on the reservation. The schools do act as a colonial force, and it's not just a question of people having access to their history. That's part of it, and that's an important thing. But that's only one part of it. The other part of a colonial education is that it tells you, it teaches you that the system as is, the system as such, is the only system that's possible. So there is no alternative, is kind of the message of too many schools in too many communities. So your job in that kind of a system is to find your place in the hierarchy of winners and losers. It's never for the full realization of yourself. It's never for the redefinition of yourself. So to oppose a colonial education isn't just to teach black history or brown history or native history. It goes way beyond that. It's to teach in a way that says, you, each of you, and you have not only a voice, but you have a right without anyone's permission to ask questions of the world. And the questions that we all need to be asking is, how did we get here? How did I come to this place? What are my alternatives? What else is possible? How can I think about a world that could be but is not yet? If you're not learning that, then you're not learning about freedom, and you're not teaching freedom. And so that's the fundamental restructuring that I think we have to engage in.
Definitely. And one last question before we go. I know that you're going to have to go and speak in front of this large group of people, but
who knows, it'll be large. Maybe just see the 7 of us.
That's true. It could be. Could you kind of speak on what gets you motivated as a social justice educator, an educator trying to change the world? What gets you out of bed every day? What is kind of like we were talking about at the lunch? I don't know if there's a better way. Dinner.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot with what Molly was saying about herself, but the way I would put it about myself is that too many people think of themselves as either pessimists or optimists. Either I'm a pessimist, I'm a cynic, and one of the things we should all realize is cynicism is a weapon of the strong. In other words, making us feel that we're nothing, that we can't make a difference. That's a weapon of the status quo. And so we have to say to ourselves, pessimists are fools because they think they know what the outcome is going to be. Optimists are also fools because they think they know what the outcome is going to be. I myself am a skeptic who's filled with hope. Why am I filled with hope? Because that's a political choice. In other words, I didn't make the world that I was thrust into. You didn't make the world you were thrust into. You didn't choose your parents. You didn't choose the year of your birth. You didn't choose the country of your birth. These things happen to you. But from that moment on, you have choices to make. And the question is partly a question of choosing hopefulness, but it's partly an existential question. Who do you want to be, Adam? Who do you want to be in a world that has nuclear weapons? Do you want to be a guy who puts your head in the sand and says, well, if we blow ourselves to hell, que sera, who cares? Or do you want to be a person who says, I didn't choose, I was born in the year nuclear weapons were dropped on a city. That was the year I was born, right? I didn't choose that. And I grew up under that sticky cloud of nuclear annihilation. So I had to choose, who am I going to be? And I choose to be an anti-nuclear activist. I didn't choose to be born into a into a society that's a warlike society. As much as we object, as much as we want to say that we're a peace society, the truth is we're a warrior society. And I didn't choose that, but I can choose who to be in light of that, and I choose, in that regard, to be a pacifist. I didn't choose to grow up in a capitalist society, but I have to choose who to be in relationship to that, and on and on and on. Male supremacist society, white supremacist society, a society that is filled with fear. I didn't choose any of that, but I get to choose who to be in light of that. So even the question of fear, and that's even on a personal note. You know, when I moved to New York City in the 70s, nobody went to Central Park. And I would walk through Central Park in the middle of the night. And people would say, "You're crazy. Why do you do that?" I'd say, "Because I choose to live in a city where I can walk through Central Park." To this day, I ride my bike from the south side of Chicago up to the University of Illinois campus. My students used to say, "You're crazy to do that." But I say, I want to live in a city where I can ride my bike all day and all night. And that's what I choose to do. That's how I choose to be. I refuse to curl up into, you know, a fetal posture and hide from the world. So I think you have to make these choices, and you have to see that you yourself have these choices. So that's what gets me up in the day, is that sense that I want to choose myself as a person who wants to live for joy and for justice, for peace and for love. The other thing is, if you live that way, you put yourself in relationship with people that blow your mind. And having lived through social movements like the Civil Rights Movement, like the Great Peace Movement against the war in Vietnam, you realize that the power of the extraordinary, ordinary people is what makes us all part of something bigger. So to see ordinary people do extraordinary things is a great energy boost for me. And I think also I have a genetic flaw, which is, most teachers have this, where if I have one student come back to me in 10 years and say, "You made a great difference in my life," that'll keep me going for the next 10. So that's crazy and delusional, but it's how I am.
Nice. And any last thoughts?
Adam, go forth, do good, man.
All right. Thank you, sir.